Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Raw podcast. I'm your host for today, James Copley, joined by Phil Smith, fresh back from his holidays. How was it, Phil?
Very, very nice indeed. But obviously, I am thrilled to be back doing the Raw podcast with you, James.
Did you get up to much?
Yes, I did. I had a lovely break in Greece, which was very, very, very nice. And I had a rare, successful day on the cricket pitch as well. So it was a good break for me. But yeah, back to normality now.
Just as a complete aside, I'm trying to think of Greek Sunderland football players. Mavrias and Kyriakos are the only two I can think of off the top of my head.
Yes, so the only two I can think of.
It's a short list.
Not being a happy hunting ground for Sunderland. Who knows? Maybe Sunderland have got someone up their sleeve this summer.
Yes, it is officially silly season, Phil. The transfer window opened this morning. Sunderland have been linked with several deals. There's the Jack Clark question as well. What should we expect, Phil? Obviously, there's a long way to go in the transfer window. Things can change often and swiftly, as we know. But where does Sunderland stand at the moment?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, we're expecting pretty much a continuation of what we've had from the last 3 or 4 windows. I think, and Kirill Dreyfus attended that Q&A evening, however you want to call it, with the Red and White Army. I think it was back in November. He sort of said we're still very much in the phase of investing in the squad. That first stage, if you like, and he said he expected that to be the case both through January and then through this summer window. And obviously we saw in January Pierre Requa arrived. And the first signing of the summer, Nectarios Triantis from Central Coast Mariners, I think that is the template. I think Sunderland, their net spend will be pretty high in the Championship this season. And the vast majority of it, I think, will be on young players, very similar to the last couple of windows. So I think it's fairly well known that Jude Bellingham is likely to sign, we think, at some point in the next few weeks. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's another few of that ilk. So yeah, I don't think we're at a stage where we can expect to see a huge amount of change in Sunderland's strategy. And that includes player sales, by the way. I think at this point, I don't expect a great deal in the amount of player sales because I think these players' value is still growing.
Yeah.
So I think the evolution, if you like, is you get to a point where some of the players that you've invested in reach peak value, you then sell them and you reinvest it, and you can potentially bring up the fees and the wages that you're spending then. I don't think we're quite at that point yet. So yeah, I think Sunderland fans can expect more of the same, and that's of course exciting because they've seen how successful some of these players have been. I suppose the one question is, will Sunderland look to balance out that recruitment a little bit with maybe a bit more experience? We saw when they got promoted from League One how important the additions of Alex Pritchard, Corey Evans, Danny Bart were. Might they look to do that in 1 or 2 positions this summer? They could also use the loan market to do that. So I think broadly speaking, we know what to expect. I think Sunderland will invest in their squad, but when fees are involved, it'll likely be young players. So I think it's exciting for fans. I suppose the question is how much do they look to strike a bit more of a balance?
We'll move on to specific targets and transfer stories in a second, but I thought it was interesting you mentioned, Phil, the broader strategy at the club, because Sunderland under Speakman are sort of earmarked as only targeting young players, aren't they? And they have, by and large, targeted a lot of young players. But when the right player comes up, e.g. a Corey Evans or an Alex Pritchard, someone who is over the age of 27, they aren't afraid to pull the trigger on that sort of deal.
No, I think the key is they're unlikely to spend any level of significant fee on those players. Yeah. I think the model, if you like, we still haven't come up with a better word. So we'll just have to
thesaurus that, don't we? We need to thesaurus that.
Sorry, everyone. But the model isn't only to sign young players. The model is to invest in young players, so that if you're spending a fee, that you have a realistic chance of recouping that or getting significantly more in the future. It's absolutely not about. One of the things that Christian Speakman looked at and spoke about when he very, very first arrived at the club was ensuring that across the squad you've got a balance of age ranges. So ideally you have a certain number of players in the, say, 17 to 22 category, a certain number of players who are in their sort of peak age category. Someone like Luke O'Nine's a perfect example. I think Luke's 28 now, isn't he? Knows his game, still improving, but has a level of experience. And then you have certain players in the slightly older category who are huge for running your dressing room, providing that sort of leadership for the younger players, if you like, both through example. My point being that they always look to have those level of players in those upper age groups as well. But what they're not going to do is spend, like I say, significant fees on those players. But as the squad evolves, they will need to replenish the players in that category, and we will see some of that this summer. And obviously, the other category that you have is almost like you just have to do them deals. If you look at the loan for Ahmad last season, well, you could look at it and say, well, their sort of right winger wasn't really a priority. And what's the long-term benefit of Sunderland? Well, there isn't a huge amount. It's just a player who they believed was so good that he could have an absolutely spectacular impact on the team in the short run. That's exactly what he did. So I think, we shouldn't get too, I think as your question kind of alluded to, we shouldn't get too drawn into thinking that the model is you can only sign players of a certain age or experience. It's just about where the level of fees, that's where the key is. But I think something very mindful that you do need that balance in your squad, and that's something to be mindful of. So we shouldn't be surprised if a 30-year-old arrives at the club. It's just we should be surprised if they've spent 6 million on them, and that's the point that we'll be wondering what's happened.
There are some of the criticism and some of the talk about this recruitment team sort of does amuse me in a way, because you'll get critics, and they're entitled to their opinion, of course. They'll come and say, well, the club's model is to buy young players on the cheap and then sell them at a massive profit. But actually, they haven't sold anybody yet for big money. They probably will at some point, don't get me wrong, but we are yet to see that phase of that transfer plan yet. So it's actually hard to judge what they're going to do in that circumstance. We have a good idea, but to me, it doesn't seem like buy cheap, sell high for the result of making a profit. It doesn't seem like that way to me, to be honest.
I don't think it's about having a high turnover. And I think I kind of get where you're going with that. And we should definitely take some confidence that there is a level of financial stability whereby when the first multi-million-pound bid for Jack Clarke comes in, Jack Clarke's off. It's not that extreme, and there isn't a requirement for it to be that extreme. I know Sunderland people, if they missed it at the time, go back and have a read when we studied and have a listen to the latest accounts. Sunderland did lose money, but the trends were pretty encouraging. And I think if you are in a position where you have some stability, you would look at a Dan Neil, for example, who Sunderland probably could have sold in any of the last 3 or 4 windows. Is Dan Neil more valuable now than when he first brought into the team? Of course he is. Has he reached anything like his peak value? He most definitely hasn't. He's just had his first season in the Championship, and we've seen him evolve and grow within that. So where could he be in another year? Where could Jack Clarke be in another year? So player sales are an absolutely inevitable part of the process. And I do think, in a way, that the structure, the jury on Sunderland's way of working will still be out until that happens. I don't think you'll ever get a complete sense of comfort and ease and confidence until Sunderland's fans see that very, very good player go out for a good fee and another very, very good player come in to replace him. I think until that happens, there'll be an inevitable and a totally understandable a sense of nervousness. I don't think that's going to change, but I don't think we're at the point yet, as I alluded to before, where these players have come close to reaching their value. Anthony Patterson, I'm sure someone could sell him for a decent fee now, but he's had 1 year in the Championship. So I think we'll be at I genuinely think this summer window will look quite similar to the last one, where we see a decent handful of players, young players, come in for fees. Very little in the way of departures. Maybe there'll be one, maybe someone will come in with a bid for one of the players that's just so good that it makes business sense for someone to take it. But generally I think the window will look much like the last one. I think we'll see a handful of these players arrive for fees, and we'll see that supplemented by whether it be a couple of loans or a couple of free agents who just add that bit of balance. I suppose what's exciting as well is, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, is that, Sunderland have made pretty clear, Christian Speakman in his interview with the club, the in-house media interview he did, didn't he? Sort of said, he didn't say if we don't get promoted next year it's a failure, but he made very clear that they were hoping to improve on what they did last year. That obviously requires a certain level of ability of player to come in, doesn't it? That's obvious. So that's going to be an interesting, although I don't expect a huge amount of change in the strategy, it's going to be interesting to see how they try to actively improve the team from what was a pretty good starting point.
I feel like, though, Phil, whilst there isn't a change in the strategy necessarily, I feel like this window in particular, the wheels are moving a bit quicker, and I think that's probably a byproduct of Sunderland knowing which division they're in. This recruitment team having been there quite a long time. They're sort of solidifying scouting plans, and basically everyone's had a long time at the club now to get the feet under the table. It does feel like Speakman, Stuart Harvey, they are trying to be very proactive and get business done early, which, to be fair, they've always stated as their aim, but sometimes it just isn't practical.
Yeah, I mentioned the word stability before in a financial sense. This is stability in a structural sense, isn't it? Whereby you're able to plan 2-3 windows in ahead. When we started doing these pods back in the dark days, that just wasn't the way the club was set up, and wasn't able to be set up because of ownership uncertainty, etc. And I think we are definitely seeing that now. I was at a press conference, excuse me, with Tony Mowbray just before the playoff semi-finals, and the question was brought up about, planning, where is Sunderland at another summer where we have a playoff campaign, extended season. Mowbray's response was really interesting, and he sort of said, really, I have to focus on the team. I'm pretty sure Christian Speakman will be thinking about what happens if we go up. How will that change our budget? How will that change our targets? But what I do know, because I've been on the meetings, is that we have a number of young players from all around the world who we think we can improve this team if we are in the Championship. And I think what we're seeing now with the Triantis deal, potentially with the Bellingham deal, hopefully to follow, potentially with Luis Semedo, we're seeing that the club were in a position where they expected they would probably be in the Championship this season. They've been planning towards that eventuality for a good few months. And it looks like they're in a good position to act. And I mean, even we talked about it at the time with a slightly critical edge, and maybe rightly so because of some of the demands in the squad elsewhere. But it was pretty obvious, wasn't it, when Pierre Ekwar came to the club, that wasn't an impact signing for the next 3 months. That really was a signing for the season, wasn't it? Now, as it happened, he did come in and make a big impact towards the end of the season. But yeah, I think we're seeing the fruits of stability you like in every sense at the club. And yeah, someone might point out that I'm completely wrong, but signing a player for a fee and being in a position to do so in the early stages of June, that's not something that I remember Sunderland being able to do particularly often. And that's, it's kind of exciting in a very boring way. It's exciting, that you have a sort of steady functioning club. Of course, there's still a lot of questions to answer. And in terms of building the squad, I think, up front's the obvious one, isn't it? Where I still think there's a huge amount of work to do, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm pretty encouraged by where the club's at. You kind of feel like there's going to be some exciting footballers arriving.
Yeah.
And that is a nice place to be.
Indeed. Did you hear that there?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Oh, good stuff. That was me mother ringing, but she'll have to wait. So we're going to drill down into specifics now, Phil, if you don't mind. The biggest transfer story in the world at the moment is Jude Bellingham going to Real Madrid, but we have a slice of that with Sunderland as well. There's obviously the speculation with Joe Bellingham, his younger brother, 17 years old. There's been multiple reports about different fees and whatnot, but my main takeaway at the moment, Phil, is that the player, from what I can sort of tell and read it between the lines, is that the player is actually pretty convinced on coming.
Yeah, I think his attendance at the at the semi-final against Luton, I think, told its own story. This is a long pursuit that's been going on. It's not kind of an impulsive thing. I think it's been something that's been in the works for a long period of time. Is there anything to be concerned about that it hasn't happened yet? I don't think so. I think there's a myriad of factors. As we said at the start of this pod, the window's only just opened. Birmingham City have been going through a takeover, as I'm sure anyone who follows the Championship's aware. Bellingham himself has been on England under-18s duty over the last week, alongside, and we must give a massive shout out, alongside Zach Johnson, Sunderland Academy player who's been playing in the under-21s this year, who actually captained the side over the weekend. That's an amazing achievement and really exciting. But back to my original point, there's plenty of reasons why we haven't seen Bellingham sort of sign on the dotted line, and with both teams back for pre-season over the next fortnight, I would expect that to progress at this stage. So yeah, it's going to be a really interesting signing, that one, off the back of not signing Mishu. I know we discussed the Mishu one at length. And Mishu himself, I think, subsequently did an interview and he spoke about how But I think it actually, do you know what? It comes across as both sides trying to make out like they were the reason that the signing didn't happen. But actually, if you put the two together, it's pretty
makes
obvious.
sense.
Pretty obvious what happened, wasn't it? Michy wasn't totally sold on the contract he was being offered. The reason he wasn't sold on that contract was because Sunderland weren't sure about his role in the team and whether it warranted that level of funding. Michy wasn't entirely sure about his tactical role. I get the impression he likes to be a little bit deeper, be that kind of setting the tone of the game. Are Sunderland 100% sure he's going to play that role? He always played as an 8. So I think you can see that actually, if you go past the headline of, oh, it was my decision or oh, it was our decision, you actually see that it was something that just didn't mesh together and there's no drama there. But I can't help but think that the Bellingham factor, was absolutely a part of all of this equation. It'll be interesting to see sort of where he fits in when he does arrive. It's because the club have put seemingly, not seemingly, clearly, have put so much time and effort into doing this deal over a period of time. It's going to be really exciting and interesting to see how he settles. And you would think that centre midfield is an area where we're not far off now. You would suggest. I think you would have to say that. I suppose it depends how they view Dan Neil. Is he going to stay in that holding midfield role? But given that we know that realistically Corey Evans is not got much chance of being fit for the first 2-3 months of the season, I think you probably still do need some cover in that position.
Yeah.
But once you put in Barr, Pritchard, Embleton, those certainly those, Jay Matete, who will have a chance in pre-season, it feels like there's going to be pretty plenty of options. I kind of feel like Tony Mowbray and Christian Speakman and Stuart Harvey-Sunderland, I feel like there's always going to be a lot of like number 8s. I don't feel like we're ever going to be like getting to the start of the season being like, what are your thoughts? Little playmakers in this squad? I'm not sure we could do with another playmaker or two. I think we'll always be fairly well stocked.
What are your thoughts on Dan Neil, actually, Phil? Because I think he did well in the number 6 role, but I don't think it's his best position. Obviously, the number 6 role does come with a lot of time and experience to really master that. It's not often you get like really natural number 6s. It does take time to develop in that role. But for me, I actually really liked it when he was breaking the lines and sort of getting forward and passing. I thought that was a really, really, really positive part of his game, and I'd like to see him develop that, to be honest.
Yeah, I think so. But I think. To be honest, I think he'll do both next year. That's my honest assessment, because we know obviously some of them are really ambitious and they want to get promoted, and player development is an absolutely huge part of what they're trying to do. And part of player development is growing them, giving them different experiences. And for Neil moving forward, if he wants to go in the Premier League, whether it be for Sunderland or somebody else, you don't want to pigeonhole a player of that ability and talent at this early age. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw him do both roles next year. I agree with you. It would seem a shame not to have him in that position where he's trying to play those killer balls and really joining up. I certainly think I like the idea of him getting a bit further forward and combining with a Pritchard or an Embleton. I think he can be really destructive. But
his role in that Redden goal,
exactly.
away from home, that's a sort of. I know that was more to the sort of right of midfield, really, but that's sort of the type of play I envisage Neil doing.
Yeah, but I think that. Yeah, totally. But I think that you also just have to respect the level he played at times towards the end of the season in that position. And if that frees you to play another 2 attacking and centre midfielders, that's pretty exciting for Tony Mowbray, because Neil's always going to be able to handle the ball. So, I feel like I'm being very long-winded today, but to get back to the original point, I think maybe another cover and centre holding midfielder, and then depending on what happens with Matete, I don't think you're a million miles off in that position.
You mentioned Dan Neil, Academy graduate Zach Johnson earlier on in the show. Really good news coming out of the club today that the Academy status had been retained. Didn't really expect anything different, but again, we've talked about it on this podcast loads of times, but such a massive asset for Sunderland, such a big catchment area. We've seen the fruits previously with Jordan Pickford, Jordan Henderson, but now you get the feeling that it's really been optimized, I think, the academy now, and it's really starting to be viewed as something that almost makes the club in a way, which beforehand I don't think it necessarily was. It was about staying in the Premier League, let's be honest.
Yeah, I think that I don't think it should be underestimated, that, because as far as I understand it, and from what I remember last year, Sunderland were only awarded last summer their Category 1 on sort of a 1-year basis rather than a 3-year basis.
Oh, right, I see.
So it shouldn't be taken for granted that they've passed the audit successfully this time around. I think again, we go back to stability. I think, Kirill Dreyfus spoke, didn't he, about how the club earlier this year finally concluded their off-field recruitment, which was a process of almost 2 years. And obviously Robin Nichols, as the academy manager arriving from Southampton, was a part of that. So yeah, it's a huge boost for the club. Again, it's what we should expect them to run a Category 1 academy. We should expect them to meet that standard. But it's probably worth noting on because, there was a time before this regime came in where it was very much up in the air, and it's obviously taken some time to keep rebuilding from that point. So it's huge. It's huge in terms of the advantages it gives you in recruitment. It's still very, very difficult for Sunderland to resist when the big Premier League clubs come calling. The rules are stacked in favour if you're top 6, 7, 8 clubs, and we should never forget that. But this gives Sunderland every chance, allied with the fact that they now have a first team structure where, they walk the walk. They don't just talk the talk with youth development.
No, absolutely.
So I think that's massive. And that, listen, if and I stress it, if Jude Bellingham signs, it's because of that. It's because of the combination of those two factors. So yeah, exciting times. Like I say, I know I mentioned it before, but I do feel like we should say how cool it is to see Zach Johnson, because that's what something they're trying to do in action. They've pushed him above his age group for a couple of years now, and they're seeing the rewards of that. So yeah, it's really, really exciting times, I feel, particularly in that aspect of the club.
Indeed. Moving swiftly on, Phil, we did touch upon it slightly earlier, but strikers, you would imagine, I wrote on the Sunderland Echo website today that if Sunderland are to achieve the stated aim of Speakman and Trihume, actually, in recent weeks, of challenging for promotion, pushing for promotion this season and in the seasons to come, if they don't manage to do it in the next campaign, they will need strikers. It's been a hot topic of debate among Sunderland fans. There's been an element of really bad luck in there as well. Who could have predicted Ross Stewart's 2 injuries, the second of which came just before the deadline? Ellis Sims was recalled to Everton as well. But the fact remains, Phil, that the last senior first-team striker to sign on a permanent basis was Stewart back in, I think it was 2021. So that is most certainly an area that needs looking at. But the positive thing is that from the report circling that Speakman and Stuart Harvey aiming to do business in that area pretty swiftly. There's the Semedo links as well. I'm sure there'll be more emerged, but yeah, you would think if Sunderland to get promoted, they'll need a couple of strikers.
They will, yeah. I think the striking one's really interesting because a large amount of the criticism, I think, has been fair. But I think there's been a couple of factors in it, and the thing that I always go back to in this discussion, almost as trying to add another layer to it, because I think the basic principle that Sunderland have not had enough players in that position over the last few windows is obvious, and I think that's a totally fair observation and criticism. That is the position also where, if you look at Sunderland, how Sunderland want to develop the squad, ideally you want a couple of kind of primary options in each position, and then maybe a youngster who can push through and be that kind of third player, if you like, or that option where if you have a short-term injury crisis, they can come in. If not, they can affect the game from the bench. They can play in cup games. Now, obviously, I think the departures of Sam Greenwood and Joe Hugill made it very difficult to do that, because I think when I think everyone knows, there was a huge gap in Sunderland's academy. Hopefully now we're beginning to see that start to, because of the catch-up period, I think that's starting to change. So players like Tom Watson, Chris Rigg, Zach Johnson, you're beginning to see those players come through now who can potentially be almost like half members of the first team squad, if that makes sense. And that can be really important. Sunderland have lacked that striker who could be that option because of the sales that happened in previous years. And the reason what I'm getting round to is, signing somebody like Semedo, 19, 20 years old. Yes, you would expect him to get plenty of game time next season, but realistically, he's not going to start 46 championship games, is he? So I think that ticks a big box for me. Somebody who you can potentially bed in over a bit of time, and hopefully in 18 months, 2 years, if he comes in on a long-term contract, you then start to see him someone who can be a real starter for you. So I think that would be a big box ticked. It's then above that where you need to kind of hang your hat on senior strikers. Well, Ross Stewart, maybe, possibly, but obviously there's the injury factor. We're hopeful he'll be back to the start of the season. 100% sure. The contractual status makes it very difficult to what happens if he gets fit, starts the season well, and someone comes in on deadline day in August, and you don't think he's going to sign a contract? That becomes a very difficult decision. So the point I'm making is that Sunderland have to sign 2 players in that position. And I think you can completely accept if one of those is a younger, slightly more improving player. I think I can totally get that. But you need someone of a bit more stature and experience as well, I think, to come in. And it is the hardest part because they are by far the most expensive players to sign. Yeah. There's a reason for that. I think we've seen, Sunderland being very proactive and very successful in investing in other areas of the pitch. And also, when I say investing, I don't just mean fees, I also mean contracts. Players like Dan Neil, their extensions, Trey Hume, etc. But it's hardest to do that up front. And that is, it sounds really boring because it just feels like we're having the same conversation again. But that is going to be the position and the topic that dominates, I think, both this window and how people view it respectively as well.
Just off piste here a little bit, but have you been following the Bordeaux story in the second division in France?
Yes, vaguely. I am aware of what's happened. Yeah,
it's insane. I'll just recap it for any. There is a point to this as well. This isn't just me coming in blindsiding, but so Bordeaux, I think, had to better a result in their last game. I think it might have been Metz's result, but they went 1-0 down. A fan then entered the pitch and caused a bit of a disturbance, pushed a player over. That player had to be stretched off. So the game was suspended by the referee. The French FA have now awarded that game against Bordeaux's opponent, so that's consigned them to another year in the French second division. This has a knock-on effect for Josh Maja. Had Bordeaux been promoted, Josh Maja would have had an option in his contract triggered for another year at Bordeaux. As it stands now, unless he signs a new deal, which is probably unlikely, he's going to be a free agent. Now, Josh Maja seems to provoke a varying range of opinions from Sunderland fans, given the way he left and such like. But if it wasn't Josh Maja, Phil, and he hadn't already played for Sunderland and he hadn't already left, at 24, a promising striker, you would be having a look at him if you were Sunderland, wouldn't you?
Yeah, for sure. I would still be having a look at him now, yeah.
Well, me too. But it seems that thought seems to irk a couple on social media, and I can understand why.
I kind of get it. I mean, I always go back to, and there's a few different scenarios where I kind of, lean on what Jack Ross said at the time, because whatever you might think of him as a manager, I rated him very highly, but I think he managed a lot of these situations really well. In
difficult circumstances as well.
Yeah, and I always remember go back to what you said about Josh, which was there are some aspects of his departure that I think he would do differently, but he was a kid at the time. And you have to allow young players and young people to make mistakes. That's life. But also what I think 4 or 5 years on is we have a lot more of the context around the way the club was run in those days and why a young player might leave to go to, at the time, the top tier of French football.
Yeah.
So I think we have a lot more context about that, and I would hope a bit more balance about how that scenario played out. It's incredibly hypothetical, isn't it? But if you're looking at somewhere where you need to add 2, potentially 3 strikers, why wouldn't you be interested in a 24-year-old with a decent goal scoring record who has experience in the division? But I have no idea what Josh's plans are. I know there was talk of significant interest from Rangers, wasn't there, earlier this summer? Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to see where he ends up. If you are asking me a ridiculous hypothetical question about whether I would have him back, which I suspect you are,
headlines, Philip. We want headlines.
I'll give you a nibble. Yes, I would. I would take him back.
Yeah, I would too. He has struggled with injury since he left Sunderland. He's been a bit stop-starty. I find this notion, people often criticise Maja and say, well, he's done nothing since he left. He has contributed for Bordeaux in the the French top league, which is quite impressive. He had a decent enough loan spell at Fulham, got 3 and 15 in the Premier League. They did get relegated, but he looked okay there. And then he struggled at Stoke, but there's not many who have gone to Stoke in the last 5 years and really set the world alight, to be honest. But that could be
Jack Clark went on loan to Stoke in January and struggled.
Exactly.
It's
January Patrick loans at Norwich and stuff like that. It's hard. It's tough.
January loans 9 times out of 10 are a complete waste of time, and that's part. And let's be brutally, I say that for a reason. One of the things that Sunderland's recruitment team have done very well is they've detached themselves. They've judged the player on where they think they can get to, rather than saying, "Oh, well, he had a bad loan there, he had a bad loan there." We're getting bizarrely way
great,
down into the Josh Maja.
I'm enjoying it. It's good. Josh Maja deep dive is what everybody needs.
Well, I don't know. Maybe people can tweet us and let us know whether they enjoyed this or whether they were absolutely baffled, and then guide our future pod schedules.
Yeah, very quickly, the one outgoing transfer story at the moment, although it has quieted down a touch, is Jack Clarke. We have mentioned him a couple of times in previous podcasts, but for me, Phil, no real need to sell. As we've mentioned, Sunderland are in a fairly good position in terms of their own finances and the contract they've actually got Clarke to, which is 2026, given that he only signed on a permanent deal last summer after his loan. It could well be one that develops over the window. He could well leave, but as I said to Joe in the previous podcast, I get the feeling that if he did go, it would be for the sort of fee that we all turned around and went, right, okay, that's fair enough, as long as it gets invested back into the squad.
Yeah, for sure. Clarke really likes it here, really appreciates the fact that he's playing every week, given, what he went through for the 2-3 years before he arrived. Sunderland aren't under any financial pressure to sell. Contractually, they're in an amazing position with him. I think Clarke, Clarke only goes, I think, unless it's the kind of fee where we all sort of whistle and go, wow. And if that's the case, fair play, because Sunderland will have turned a spectacular profit in 18 months on a player.
Is it probably worth noting, though, Phil, that there might be a Tottenham clause in there as well in terms of a percentage of any profit or whatever.
Yeah, there absolutely is. It would, and that's also why some of the fees that have been touted, you have to factor that in as well. Why someone might balk at those fees, because
7 million, even if there wasn't, or 7 to 9 million, even if there wasn't a percentage, is laughable. I think.
Yeah, it's you're looking at double that, aren't you? I think sometimes when we're close to a club and we see things in a certain way, it's very easy to overvalue players as well and say, well, he's worth. But I agree with you. We're talking double that minimum, and then maybe we can start to sweat a bit. But at this stage, sitting here right now, I don't see that as a huge concern at this stage. But it is the transfer window, stranger things, and all that.
You can tell you've been doing this a while, Phil, that you prefix everything with "at this stage."
Yeah, but listen, like I've covered, so I have been doing this quite a long time, and it's true that what is true at 1:35 on Wednesday, the 14th of June, can stop being true at 1:38.
Oh God, don't we know it? Don't we know it?
So it's, and I think that's the context for people listening as well. As we've seen so many things where it changes like that. But at this stage, I would say I'm very hopeful that Clarke will be in that starting 11 on the first day of the season and beyond.
Indeed. Well, we'll probably wrap it up there, Phil. You can follow all of the latest transfer news over at the Sunderland Echo website. We'll endeavour to cover everything for you. You can, of course, subscribe to the podcast as well if you'd like. And if you please like, share, retweet, all of that sort of stuff helps with the algorithms. And once again, thank you very much for listening.